Hey everyone, welcome back to Dungeon Brew. We're going to be continuing our government series, and today we are talking about autocracies. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
Hey everyone, we are talking about autocracies today on Dungeon Brew. If you missed our previous video, we talked about anarchies and broke down the various types of videos we're going to be talking about during this series. Today, we're going to get into those types of government that are ruled by one individual. Joshua, can you get us started with autocracies?
Yeah, today we're talking about autocracies. This is, like you said, a government which is typically within the hands of a single person, thought of as a monarchy or a dictatorship, something along those lines. It's probably the most common used in fantasy settings, which makes sense because oftentimes we're reflecting medieval times where this was seen fairly frequently within history. It's a type of government that's reserved for individuals. It's typically around like their lineage, their divine right, or some sort of similar notion in that way. So I'm going to start off by talking about absolute monarchies, which again are probably what we're most familiar with. We've seen these in ancient Sumerian and Akkadian city-states. We've seen them throughout medieval Europe and France and England. In an absolute monarchy, this is where your autocrat is rising through the right of blood. It's usually tied to their bloodline, why they're in power. That power is unquestioned. Sometimes this is tied to like the divine authority. You know, God has chosen this individual to rule and to decree his laws throughout the lands, but not always. Sometimes there's just, particular bloodlines that put them into play. And anyone with power under that monarch only maintains that power until it's taken away by the monarch themselves or by some other type of intervention or, a war, so to speak.
Yeah, and we, like I said, we see this in our own history. This is what we associate with England, with France, with a lot of those medieval monarchies. And like you said, if you look at the succession for various monarchies, most of the time it's tied through blood, but you definitely have situations where there's conflicts and there's wars, power to determine who's going to be the next king or queen or whoever. So it's should be fairly familiar, I think, to a lot of people when you talk about what an absolute monarchy is.
Mm-hmm.
And I would point out that this can be differentiated with, because, for instance, there's monarchies that exist in the world right now, but sometimes they have things like parliament that amend that monarchy, and the power has shifted and that type of thing. So you can have a monarchy mixed with another government type if you're interested.
Yeah, that's true.
So,
which is, I think, why England is so confusing to us sometimes.
Yeah, us in the U.S. Okay, so the next one on our list is a despotism, which is ruled by a despot. The despot is an autocrat who rules through power. Generally speaking, this is physical power of some kind. We tend to see these in less developed cultures. This is usually a starting government. We talked about this a little bit in our anarchy video, but the idea of a despot is someone who has has the physical power or the authority through force of arms through allies, potentially, that allow them to maintain power within a government or within a society. Generally speaking, the rite of passage could potentially be through blood, but most oftentimes it's actually whenever that despot becomes too weak or too frail to maintain that power or authority, somebody else comes in and takes it from them. This is kind of the traditional leader of the pride. You have the alpha male lion, and eventually that alpha male lion is overthrown by a younger lion who comes up and becomes stronger or bigger or somehow more physically capable than the old lion and overthrows him. That's traditionally what you would think of in terms of a despotism.
Yeah, and we talked about this a little bit too. Sometimes you hear despots being used interchangeably, almost as though they're synonymous, I think, in modern literature and the way that it's written about. So you may see that word used kind of freely, but in terms of what we're talking about here, I think this is a good way of looking at it. I think I like the Gutians, who were considered to be a wild people in ancient Mesopotamia, kind of having this type of thing. The Byzantines may have fit underneath this a little bit. They were probably more into it as an imperial autocracy, which I'll talk about in a minute. But there's some examples, I think, especially like you said, that you would see in our most ancient history of where despotism existed.
And I think it's a good transition government, too. If you're looking at a despot transitioning into something like an absolute monarchy, that might be a scenario where somebody managed to seize power through physical power, and then they have done something to maintain that. They've either instituted laws or something that prevents them from being physically challenged. They've gotten a gathering of maybe their friends and family who are loyal to them, who prevent anybody from physically challenging them, and then they start passing on their rulership by right of blood, through divine power, or through some other means. And generally speaking, I think that that's some of the confusion that comes in with despotism, because that transition occurs, and they are a despot, they do have that power, and the transition has then become something else to continue on with that form of autocracy.
Yeah, it was just why we see that synonymous piece, which you're going to find in some of these other things we're going to be talking about too.
Right.
So imperial autocracies, which is the next one on this list that you may choose to have in forms of an autocracy, is where you have an autocrat that has ruled with this imperial type of authority. Their power is recognized as superseding from other authorities. They're the king of other kings. They're an emperor. They're above all other powers. Oftentimes, this also includes divine authorities in nature. Sometimes these individuals are actually deified while they're still in life, not just like posthumous. So people like Caesar, for example, would have started his campaign and his rulership through an imperial autocracy.
Yeah, and you also could think of things like ancient Egyptian pharaohs would be imperial style autocrats. They are considered to be gods walking among men type of a thing. And that is the type of autocracy that you could probably associate with this. This is the type of power that you also see with the Iliad, with King Menelaus, who is starting to try and conquer other kings and identifies himself as the king of kings because he is subverting all other kings underneath his authority and sees himself as being above them.
And if I remember correctly, Xerxes as well.
Yes.
In ancient history, it was a good example of that.
Yeah, so there's a variety of examples actually on the way that somebody gets to that point. Now, the interesting thing is, the next one on our list that I find very interesting is the military autocrat, and you mentioned Caesar. I think that Rome in general became this kind of imperial autocracy, but the way in which Caesar seized power was through a military means, and that's what a military autocrat is. It is somebody who is coming in and taking power through strength of arms, which is different than the despot. The despot is doing it usually through individual. I am an individual conquering another individual. Military autocracy is, I have the army, I have the military force in order to seize control. Because when you get into periods of time in which military power becomes significant enough that you are able to control it or use it to your advantage, suddenly, if you've got all of the armies, then you're the one who's in charge, and who's going to challenge that? Nobody, that's it.
So how does that fit with Alexander the Great? Would that be determinative of his expansion into the east and taking different countries and like Babylon and trying to hold them before he lost and had to fall back again?
I mean, he really falls more into, I think that he is conquering other nations, whereas a military autocracy would be taking control of the military that exists in the nation you're currently in. So, in the United States, if I take control of the United States military in order to seize power, that would be a military autocracy. Whereas if, Canada took their military and conquered the United States, that's not really a military autocracy. That's more of them conquering our nation, and they may have whatever government they currently have still in existence.
Gotcha. Thank you for that clarification. I think that those, like I said, these terms sometimes get confusing even in my own head as I'm trying to categorize them and where they fall at.
Well, and there's a lot of mix and matching too. So in some of these instances, it's like you can have parts and parcels of each one of these and create something unique if you really want to. And we're doing a very short list compared to the number and the variety of governments that exist in the world.
Yeah, god damn it. Stop making new lists. Stop creating new governments. All right, so another one that would fall underneath autocracy would be what's called a theonomy. This is where people and laws are tied to divine laws or prescripts that have been written. These laws typically can't exceed beyond those prescripts, though I sometimes question on, maybe they're interpreted differently. So then they exceed in some way. But there's no specific autocrat who rules, because the deity or the deities are considered to be the rulers instead within that system. In these governments, you see that the laws are typically stagnant, and they're enforced by citizens who operate within the confines of those laws. Like, for instance, they may stone a murderer to death because it is written to be so.
Right.
I'm hearing Game of Thrones in my head. It is known, it is written,
Right.
Yeah,
and this is not a very common style of government, to say the least, because as we've talked about many times, when there's a vacuum of power, somebody seizes power. But the idea of a theonomy is basically, and I'm not necessarily saying that this is the case or whatever, but something like going, okay, the Bible is the law, and then you have people who enforce the laws in the Bible without seeking to amend them or change them or do anything else. It becomes this almost autocratic tome of what is right and what is wrong, and everything that exists within the government is tied to that single piece of documentation. So it's a very interesting, I think, style of government that could be implemented, I think, in a fantasy setting in some very unique ways if you're wanting to get creative with it. But the way that manifests is really up to you.
Yeah, I feel like I have a couple of examples to provide for this, but I'm just not well versed enough in them to share it. I'm just like, I know of specific instances where there are these books that are used as like a course of knowledge and law within regions, even within today's world. But there are, as we said, there's other forms of government that support them and are around them. So it's not just solely that book of laws,
right?
As this may indicate,
right. So the last one on our list for autocracies is the tyranny, which is ruled by the tyrant. So the tyrant is someone who is usurping power. So in some instances, we talked about, for instance, the military autocracy where Caesar seized power using the military. The tyrant can use other means of doing that. They can subvert, eliminate, or coerce their way into power. So it might be something like using loopholes in the laws that allow them to seize power in some way. But they maintain that power usually through threats of violence, maintaining those loopholes that allowed them to seize power, and then continuing to maintain that ambivalence in the law that allows them to maintain that position, or eliminating other viable candidates. So this is something I actually think that we see fairly frequently in our world today, where there is a democracy of some kind, and then they manipulate the democratic system in order to get into power as a president, or whatever you want to call it. And once they're in power, they start making it to where other candidates they disappear and they're not able to run for that presidential position, or they manipulate the vote tallies so that they're always winning with like 90% accuracy or 90% of the popular vote, that type of situation. That's what a tyrant is. There can be a different type of government, but somehow they get themselves into power and then maintain that power through usually suspicious ways.
You're only a tyrant until you acquire a new title. I think that Stalin probably fits well within this conceptualization. I think that a lot of his tactics were considered to be tyrant in nature until he accomplished power. But he continued to use some of these tactics even in that position. So he was a tyrant, but he may have been called a despot. So it's like this. It's almost like they sometimes assume multiple titles to kind of cover up some of the activities that they're engaging in to maintain their authority or their power over a nation. Would that be safe to say?
Yeah, like I said, because they don't want to be, they want to be seen as a legitimate ruler. They want to maintain their power, and you don't get into a position like that and go, haha, I'm your new ruler, the tyrant. They go, I'm president, or I am, whatever title they want to give themselves in order to try and seem legitimate in that position. This is, I think that a tyrant or tyrannies are thrown around a lot as a descriptor, but it's a very specific scenario that kind of gets them into that position and then allows them to maintain that power or maintain that authority in a specific way. Usually this is the type of situation where a tyrant will get into power and then maintain that power for a very long period of time because there's enough respect within the government initially to allow them to take that position, and nobody wants to really rebel against that. And then once they have it, once they're in there long enough, they can start to change things and manipulate things to maintain that power. Suddenly, it's like there's no limitation on the number of times that they can run for president. And then it's like, well, I only have to run for president once every 10 years instead of once every 4. That type of situation that allows them to get into that position and then basically just hold on to it for the rest of their life.
Yeah, I off the top of my head, I'm thinking of, little tidbits or advice I would give around running autocracies. We've given you a pretty interesting list here, I think, to pick and choose from. That quote in my head always kind of stands out, that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Is it Bacon that said that? God, I hope I have that right.
I know, I was wanting to make references to like Hobbes and all kinds of stuff, but my philosophy is still a little bit rough.
Yeah, but whatever the case, I think that many times we think of these autocracies as having high levels of corruption within the system, whether we're talking about, a autocracy or an absolute monarchy or even the tyranny, which I think the tyranny and corruption goes hand in hand. But what does it mean for you to create then a civilization or a society that has autocracy that does not have high levels of corruption? What does that look like in terms of the benevolent ruler? How do you challenge and throwing some of those tropes on their head? So, do with it what you will. I'm just saying that if you do run autocracies, you might look at some of the tropes that are oftentimes kind of threading themselves in there and seeing how you can challenge your players to think about things differently or give them a different experience.
I think that that's really important too. One of the big things that I really want to key on that you touched on, which is that I think we oftentimes associate an autocracy with something that is evil or negative or bad. It does not have to be. You can have somebody who is in charge, who is an autocrat, who is actually a benevolent ruler, who does great things for the society, who makes beneficial changes that make life better for the people who live underneath them. That can extend everywhere from, an absolute monarchy, which we have plenty of examples throughout history of monarchs who were very good rulers, all the way through a tyrant who somehow seized power and did it through nefarious means. But once they were in power, they're actually doing really good stuff for the world, They're making their lives, the lives of their citizens better. They're making sure they have food. They're making sure that they have wealth. They're making sure that there isn't inequalities that exist within the system. But like you said, playing on those tropes, I think, is a very interesting way. You can definitely go the evil, crazy tyrant route, but you can also go the other route, and there's nothing to stop you. I think the best way is to have that balance, to have something where it's like, okay, there's good and there's bad. That gives that moral gray area for your PCs to play off of, and then it gives them difficult decisions to make on whether or not they actually want to be involved in, a resistance that wants to overthrow this tyrant who really isn't doing that bad of a job.
Yeah, we again probably could jump into a number of different paths and talk about the philosophy around those types of things, but I think that's a great point to end on. Anything else on autocracies that you want to provide before we end for the day?
I don't think so. Like I said, I think the big things are play with tropes, like you mentioned. Combine your governments. We're going to get into democracies in the next video and oligarchies after that. So there's plenty of room for you to start playing with the idea of how can I mix and match my autocracy with my democracy or my autocracy with my oligarchy and see how that plays out. So pay attention to those upcoming videos so that you can get some creative type governments put into your game.
All right. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with us today. Your call of action is to hit that subscribe button, like the video, leave a comment, share it with somebody, do all 4 of them, and you get a prize. The joy of goodness in your heart. All right, guys. We'll see you in the next video.
Jon and Josh.